Hi everyone, and welcome to Western Civ 2. I'm Ryan P. Johnson, and today's lesson will dive into the French Revolution. If you're a current student of mine, you'll find a quiz in the French Revolution module in the course LMS. Please take a moment to access that quiz now and follow along with this presentation. If you're not a current student of mine, thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoy this lecture and learn something about one of the most important events in Western history. Also, if you could take a moment to subscribe to my channel, well, that'd be a heck of a thing. All right, my students have likely had enough time to get the quiz up and running, so on to the revolution. The French Revolution did not happen in a vacuum. There were a series of smaller revolutions that took place across Europe and beyond in the late 18th century. For starters, the American revolutionaries succeeded, with no small amount of French help, in securing their independence from Great Britain. American independence had ramifications in mainland Europe, as the Dutch Republic's bankers owned much of America's debt, and therefore hoped independence would allow the Americans to begin paying down that debt. However, the leader of the Republic, called the Stadtholder, supported England, causing a rift between political and economic leaders. Wealthy bankers and merchants organized a militia known as the Free Corps to help them overthrow the Stadtholder, which they did, at least for a hot minute. Prussia, whose royal family was connected to the Stadtholder via marriage, intervened and brought this rebellion to an end. Next door in Belgium, which was under Austrian control, enlightened reforms were brought up by Austrian Emperor Leopold II. The abolition of torture and religious toleration were among the slate of changes Leopold allowed. However, upper-class elites, worried that Leopold may go farther and infringe on their privileges, began to resist. In a strange turn of events, they were aided by members of the lower classes, who you would think would be all for those elite members of society losing some of their closely guarded liberties. On the contrary, some members of the lower classes wanted complete independence for Belgium, and that meant opposing the emperor, and that meant siding with the elites. Belgian independence was secured, but again only for a hot minute, before class divisions split apart the coalition. The lower classes switched sides, now believing that an enlightened emperor was better for them than an unenlightened upper class. This about-face allowed Leopold to regain control of Belgium. Finally, a revolt by Poles looking to modernize the government along Western European lines and upset over various partitions of Poland was crushed by Russia after only 1 year. Despite the fact that in Europe all of these revolts failed, together they showed a great deal of angst among certain groups of society, and the willingness to take great risks to secure for themselves a better deal. It's in this larger context that France would embark on the most cataclysmic of all the revolutions. In his book, A Short History of the French Revolution, historian Jeremy D. Popkin has argued that rather than a strong, oppressive monarchy leading to the outbreak of revolt in France, it was the profound weaknesses of the monarchy that opened the door for revolution. The most glaring weakness, according to Popkin, was financial. French kings were responsible for a great deal of expenses. First among these expenses was the army, which had grown under Louis XIV to 400,000 standing troops. War is not cheap, as men have to be provided with uniforms, weapons, ammunition, training, medical care, barracks, and supplies of all kinds while in the field. Louis XIV had also engaged in numerous wars that left France in tremendous debt. Debt that was not cleared by his successor, Louis XV. Louis XVI, who came to power in 1774 and would rule through the beginning of the Revolution, did not help the situation. Louis spent millions of French livres on helping the Americans fight against one of France's main rivals, the British. Despite getting won over the Brits, helping the Americans did not produce any tangible benefits for France. It only worsened French debt. Speaking of getting won over their rivals, keeping pace with and indeed outshining rivals was another expense of French monarchs. French kings were trained to think of their kingdom as the preeminent power in Europe, and to spare no expense competing against the likes of the British or the Austrians. Domestically, French monarchs were obligated to maintain infrastructure like roads, as well as the court system which provided justice for the people. Further, royal universities and academies were kept up by the king, as was the administration that served to prop up the king. Taken together, all of these financial obligations put a lot of pressure on French monarchs. To make matters worse, another weakness of French kings was their inability to efficiently or effectively collect enough tax money to offset these expenses. The biggest factor why this has to do with the social system of France. For centuries, society had been organized into 3 different groups or estates. The first estate was the clergy, as they had the important task of looking after every subject's immortal soul. The second estate consisted of the French nobility, in theory the defenders of society, both from external and internal threats. However, by the time of the Revolution, the nobility, though they made up the officer corps of the army, was focused on things other than fighting. Finally was the third estate, which included everyone not in the first 2 estates. That means the third estate was a very diverse group, including everyone from wealthy merchants and businessmen to the poorest of the poor. Power, political, economic, and social, in this arrangement was concentrated in the hands of the first 2 estates, which together made up roughly 3 to 5% of the total population of 28 million people. The first 2 classes held certain privileges that the vast majority of the French population did not hold. For our discussion, the most important privilege was exemption from paying most, and in some cases all, taxes. In other words, those with the greatest ability to contribute to the funds that kept the nation afloat simply didn't do so. Noble and church exemptions from taxation meant the membership of the third estate had to shoulder the nation's financial burden. You may be thinking, but wait, couldn't the king, as an absolute ruler, simply order the nobles and church to pay taxes? No, he could not. In France, many privileges of the upper classes were enshrined by custom and tradition, if not actually codified by law. Nobles defended their privileges tooth and nail, and since courts were normally overseen by aristocrats, they would usually rule in favor of the privileged estates against royal attempts to reform the system. If the king tried to push his luck, he could witness a full-scale revolt of some wealthy and very powerful people. Another problem regarding taxes was the way in which they were collected. French kings, in order to try and save money, allowed private individuals to bid for the right to collect taxes in a certain area. These folks, known as tax farmers, would competitively, and likely in some cases not so competitively, bid for a contract giving them the power, backed by the monarchy, to collect taxes in a given region. The contract usually included a set amount of money the king expected to get, and as long as the tax farmer provided the king that amount by a set date, all was good. This system was ripe for abuse, though. Tax farmers often had no qualms about squeezing every last cent they could from the people, and pocketing the excess revenue once they reached what the king expected from them. This corruption, and the blind-eyed kings turned to it, infuriated many ordinary French people, who clearly saw that they were being pushed for more while their, quote, social superiors paid little to nothing at all. One of the problems with the monarchical form of government is that much depends on the person of the monarch. Strong, confident, assertive monarchs could rule successfully, maintain peace, and build a strong state over the course of decades. Unfortunately for France, Louis XVI was not strong, confident, or assertive. Rather, the king was shy, hesitant, passive, and always ready to be influenced by the last person he talked to. Not exactly the qualities you want in a king in any situation, much less the one France faced in the last quarter of the 18th century. His weakness was compounded by the person of the queen, the Austrian princess Marie Antoinette. The two were married as a means of bringing peace to the two nations. Because, the best way to settle a feud is to make your enemies your in-laws. The French queen spent lavish amounts of money on parties, hairstyles, gambling, and clothes, which gave her the impression of being out of touch with the struggles of ordinary French citizens. Further, her and Louis did not conceive their first child until 7 years into their marriage, which, despite being Louis's fault, led to vicious rumors of the queen's loose living. Pornographic pamphlets depicted Marie Antoinette as a harlot who was openly and repeatedly cuckolding the king, which only lessened respect for the monarchy as an institution and opened the door to more serious criticism. In 1787, Louis XVI summoned a meeting of the Assembly of Notables, a collection of the king's closest advisors, along with high-ranking nobles and church officials. At this meeting, the king proposed a series of changes to try to alleviate the financial crises the kingdom was in, but mutual suspicion prevented any reforms from being enacted. There were, though, two very important decisions that came out of the Assembly of Notables. First, Louis agreed to hire the Swiss banker Jacques Necker as finance minister. Necker had been finance minister once before, and raised the ire of the monarchy by publishing the royal finances, so that everyone could see the revenue versus the expenses of the king. Necker also very publicly argued that the first duty of the king was to ensure that every man, woman, and child had enough food to eat every day. These actions made Necker the people's, quote, man on the inside, the one minister who had the interests of the ordinary subject at heart. Second, the king also agreed to summon the Estates General in 1789, a meeting of representatives of all three estates of French society. This was a big deal, as the last time the Estates General met was in 1614, nearly 200 years previously. The king initially agreed to this proposition because he believed some agreement could be reached to fix France's economic problems beforehand, thus obviating the need for the Estates General. According to tradition, each estate sent 300 representatives to the Estates General. Also, each group of delegates met separately in their own chamber and got one vote, based on what the majority of each estate's reps wanted. Therefore, the first estate got one vote, the second estate got one vote, and the third estate got one vote. This quite obviously works against the third estate, as the other two had much in common, being the privileged orders that they were. Finally, in order for any changes to take place, the vote had to be unanimous. This customary arrangement, therefore, was yet another feature of French politics that benefited the elites. In the wake of the decision to summon the Estates General, towns, cities, parishes, and other groups all over France began to compile lists of grievances, or lists of items each group would send to their representatives in Versailles. It was the rep's job to compile these lists into one master list of items to be discussed once the meeting began. As no other solution could be devised to alleviate France's financial woes, the king realized that the Estates General would actually meet. Prior to the opening of the meeting, Jacques Necker convinced Louis to throw the Third Estate a bone and double the number of representatives they received. In other words, the Third Estate would have 600 representatives, while each of the other two estates would only have 300. This put a sharp focus on how the voting would proceed. Some lists of grievances from the Third Estate called for voting to be by head count, meaning each individual representative got one vote, as opposed to the entire collection of reps getting one vote. With 600 reps, if voting was by head count, the Third Estate could at the very least tie the other two estates and effectively block any of their proposals. Additionally, if just one representative from either of the other two estates defected and joined the Third Estate, they'd have enough votes to overpower the privileged orders. That would be the first time in France's long history that the ordinary people would have the final say on new legislation, that regular subjects could write the rules they'd all live under. The question of how voting would go then became the central issue as the representatives made their way to the Palace of Versailles. On May 5th, 1789, the Estates General officially opened. Both the king and Jacques Necker gave speeches to the assembled delegates, but neither said anything about the voting process. The delegates for the clergy and the nobility began moving to their own chambers. The reps for the Third Estate, however, refused to organize themselves until the question of voting was answered. The proceedings were thus bogged down for 6 weeks, until on June 17th, 19 members of the clergy jumped ship and joined with the Third Estate. Now they had 619 votes versus 581 for the nobles and clergy combined, enough to pass measures they wanted should the vote be by head count. The delegates did not wait for the king to make a decision on that, though. They immediately issued a declaration calling themselves the National Assembly and asserting their right to make laws for France as they represented nearly the entire population. They stridently asserted that the other reps that had not joined their ranks could not stop them nor exercise power independently of the National Assembly. Even more shockingly, they also claimed the king could not veto any of their measures. It was a phenomenal moment in a year filled with phenomenal moments. 3 days later, the delegates of the National Assembly found that the doors to their meeting hall were locked and that armed guards filled the palace. Concerned about measures the king may be taking to stop them, they went to the only other place large enough to hold all of them, the old tennis courts. Here they issued the famous tennis court oath, pledging that they would never separate from each other until their work was done, and stating that the National Assembly was made up of the people, not the location. So wherever the delegates met, that's where the laws of France would be made. A few weeks later, on July 11th, Louis XVI fired Jacques Necker, citing his poor performance at the Estates General as the reason for the sacking. When word of this reached the people of Paris, 12 miles away, it prompted a major reaction. Large groups of men and women gathered whatever weapons they could, including firearms. They needed gunpowder to use them, however, and they knew exactly where to get it. Dramatic pause. The Bastille was a royal fortress and prison, and stood as a monument to royal power and despotism. The crowd demanded that the commander release the 7 prisoners kept inside and hand over the gunpowder. The commander refused, leading to perhaps the most famous moment of the revolution, the storming of the Bastille. The guards could not hold back the crowd, who gained entry to the fortress, freed the prisoners, took the gunpowder, and proceeded to tear the entire building down brick by brick. They also dragged the commander through the streets, killed him, and started a revolutionary tradition by cutting off his head, parading it around town on the end of a pike. As all of this was happening, members of the crowd, along with others watching the scene, began to form groups of unofficial militia that took the name National Guard. They realized that someone needed to try and keep the peace, and the royal officials were helpless against the agitated population of Paris. Command of the Guard was given to the Marquis de Lafayette, the man who had served with George Washington and other Americans during the Revolutionary War. The end of July 1789 saw an event known now as the Great Fear. Rumors in the French countryside began to spread that bands of thugs in aristocratic pay were rampaging across the land, attacking villages and ordinary French people in an effort to intimidate them out of supporting the National Assembly. Though these were just rumors and there were no actual bands of thugs, the reaction to the rumors was quite real. Groups of peasants across France armed themselves with whatever they could and began storming noble chateaux. Some homes were burnt, some nobles and their families harmed. The thing the peasants really wanted, however, were any documents codifying the obligations they owed to the noble in question, as well as any that contained the privileges that noble enjoyed. These papers were burned, erasing any proof of the obligations peasants owed. Once word reached Versailles about these riots in the countryside, something extraordinary happened on the night of August 4th. A delegate from the nobility, appalled by the reports he was hearing about the Great Fear, stood up in front of the assembly. He gave a speech in which he renounced all of his noble privileges. After he stepped down, another noble did the same, and then another, and another, until early the next morning, the assembly had effectively ended the system of feudal relations that was still hanging by a thread in France. 1 week later, they put down their actions on paper and issued the decree abolishing the feudal system. In this document, the assembly outlawed all tax exemptions, abolished things like hunting privileges, made government offices open to merit rather than birth, and provided for free dispensation of justice. This was a major step in attempting to redress the power imbalance that had existed prior to the Revolution, a period now referred to as the Ancien Régime. On August 26th of the same year, remember, we're still in 1789 here, making this one of the most pivotal years in Western history. The Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Filled with Enlightenment thinking, the rights of man called for the freedom to express one's opinion, the assurance of individual liberty, granted the power of all men to participate in the creation of the laws, stipulated that the general will should decide what the law is, and provided individuals with protections against arbitrary abuse of power. The Rights of Man is perhaps the most important document to emerge from the Revolutionary period, a period that, as we're seeing, was full of important documents. Similar to the United States Bill of Rights, the Rights of Man laid out the basic rights every French citizen now enjoyed. And when it came time to create the structure of their new government, the aim was for the delegates to keep the rights of man in mind and build a government that would ensure those rights were real and not just words on paper. So impactful has the rights of man been that today's United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights is modeled after it. However, by phrasing the rights of man as the rights of, well, men, the Assembly left some important questions unanswered. Did the rights of man include women? Or were the rights literally for men only? What about religious minorities? The rights of man did protect people's right to hold any religious opinion, after all. How far did that protection extend? And what about slaves in the Caribbean colonies? Many of them were men, so did they now get the freedoms listed in the rights of man? What about slave women? Women were not just sitting back and watching the men make these momentous changes. Even though the National Assembly did not have a single female delegate, women took an active role in all the revolutionary fervor. They started women's political clubs and wrote pamphlets. In October 1789, a group of hundreds of Parisian women marched to Versailles to demand that the king and the assembly move to Paris, where the people could keep a better eye on them. They were joined during the march by thousands of other people. A scuffle ensued outside the palace that led to the deaths of protesters and guards. In the end, the women succeeded and brought the assembly and king, along with his family, back to Paris to continue their work in the Tuileries Palace. In 1791, a playwright named Olympe de Gouges sought to remedy the weakness she and other women saw in the rights of man. She issued her own document called the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. Modeled after the earlier document, the rights of woman explicitly includes women in every point, calling for them to receive the same freedoms that had already been granted to men. De Gouges was not a member of the legislature, however, and her document was never given any official blessing. After the Rights of Man was issued, there was a lull in the action as the National Assembly began putting together a new constitution to establish a constitutional monarchy. The new system they created called for a unicameral, or one-house, legislature. It gave the king a suspensive veto only, meaning he could delay the passage of legislation for a time, but not fully stop it. It also created a distinction between active and passive citizens. Active citizens were those who paid enough money in yearly taxes to secure the right to vote, while passive citizens did not pay enough money and therefore could not vote. Even higher wealth requirements were needed to be met in order to hold office, such that only about 72,000 men could serve in the national legislature. All of these decisions are problematic, and some will come to haunt later revolutionaries. A unicameral legislature may allow proposals to become laws more quickly, but it also allows bad laws to take effect more easily. The king only having a suspensive veto would poison the relationship between king and legislature without giving the king any real power. Finally, making a distinction between active and passive citizens gave the right to vote to nearly half of the men in France. However, the other half still could not vote, nor could women. This particularly seemed to violate some of the principles the revolution had built itself on earlier. In addition to the problems the constitutional setup would create, the National Assembly ran into resistance for the first time with the passage of the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which from here on out I'll refer to as the CCC. This was an attempt by the Assembly to regulate what it felt were abusive or inefficient practices of the Catholic Church in France. The CCC called for the state, not the church, to pay the clergy. It called for ecclesiastical or religious administrative districts to match the new secular districts set up by the Assembly. This led to the abolition of some dioceses and bishoprics across France. The CCC also set the pay scale for the various levels of clergy and called for them to be chosen not by the church, which was traditional, but rather via election. Most disturbingly of all, from the church's perspective, was the oath of loyalty to the state that each newly elected clergyman had to swear before being confirmed in their office. The Pope condemned the CCC, and half of the French clergy flat out refused to swear the oath, a move that cost them their positions. The issuing of the CCC is a nice bridge between the liberal phase of the revolution, which we've been discussing up to this point, and the more radical and violent phase of the revolution, which we'll get to momentarily. The CCC was the first time some ordinary French people began to question the National Assembly and its decisions. Most of them were satisfied with the breaking of the monarchy. Most of them were satisfied with the breaking of the monarchy's monopoly on power and the new rights that had been given to the people. There was discontent over the Constitution, yes, but the CCC really hit a nerve. People don't tend to like it when someone messes with their religion, as faith is incredibly important to many people. The CCC appeared to be a situation where the National Assembly was crossing a line, moving into territory many felt it had no business moving into. One of those who disagreed with the CCC was Louis XVI. Louis, angered over the CCC and the diminution of his powers, decided on drastic action. In June of 1791, he and the royal family escaped from the Tuileries Palace and made for the Austrian Netherlands. The story is beautifully told by Timothy Tackett in his book When the King Took Flight. Tackett traces the origins of the plan, the intricacies of the escape, the mistakes made by the royal entourage, and the effect the revolution had on people hundreds of miles from Paris. Louis was recognized before reaching the border and, along with his family, was forced to return to Paris. To compound the problem, Louis had left a note in his office addressed to the revolution. In it, he castigated the assembly for the way it had reduced his power and prestige. The note was essentially an admittance that all of his previous, quote, support for the revolution was a lie. His attempted escape caused some in the assembly to question whether or not France really needed a king. Perhaps, they thought, France could be ruled by the assembly and the assembly alone. However, the majority of the delegates believed that Louis was essential to the new government. After all, they had just finished creating a constitutional monarchy which needed a monarch. It was too late now to dramatically shift gears. They had to try and repair the relationship as best as they could. In 1791, elections were held under the new constitution. Due to everyone's uncertainty regarding how voting worked, only about 25% of eligible voters actually cast votes for the new legislative assembly. A figure who would soon play a dominant role in the revolution, Maximilien Robespierre, shamed the delegates of the National Assembly into not running for re-election. This meant all 745 delegates to the Legislative Assembly were brand new, with no experience running an entire state. Additionally, all the reps came from the Third Estate. There was no input from the nobility or clergy this time around. The lack of experience would come into play during the first major crisis faced by the assembly. During the earlier phase of the revolution, many nobles, fearing for their privileges and not willing to give them up as some of their colleagues in Paris had, simply left. Many traveled to the Austrian Netherlands, the same location the king had tried to escape to. The assembly delegates were concerned about French nobles concocting a plan with the Austrian emperor to invade France and end the revolution. This fear led to a fateful decision: the declaration of war against Austria in April 1792. The king supported the war. He figured either one of two things would happen. Either the war would go well and he would gain added respect and perhaps even power within the government, or the war would go poorly and Austria would reestablish the monarchy with him on the throne. Either way, the king reasoned, he won. The declaration of war was more problematic for the delegates in the assembly, since many leaders of France's army had been nobles that fled the kingdom. Additionally, the French armies were woefully undersupplied and not ready to fight against another major power. Lastly, the French armies were in disarray due to the upheaval of the Revolution. So France declared war without an army, without any military leaders, and without any supplies. To complicate matters even further, Austria's ally Prussia jumped to Austria's defense. France now faced not one, but two opponents. As you would expect, the ad hoc army France created did very poorly initially, suffering defeat after defeat. After the Austro-Prussian force took the fortress city of Verdun, the last line of defense protecting Paris, the leader of the invading force, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a manifesto promising leniency for those who did not resist the Austrians and Prussians. He also, however, promised swift retribution for any resistance encountered, including a threat to burn the city of Paris to the ground should any harm befall the king or his family. The citizens of Paris reacted with terror and anger over the military developments. Fearing what would happen if the Austro-Prussian forces made it to Paris and released all of the political prisoners, groups of radicals stormed the prisons, brought some prisoners before tribunals that confirmed their guilt, and executed them. Some did not even get a tribunal, but were rather murdered in their own cells. The September massacres saw the deaths of roughly 1,300 people in Paris, one of the bloodiest single nights of the Revolution. Even before the violence of the September massacres, the citizens of Paris made their desires clear to the assembly. In August, a large group of passive citizens, those denied the right to vote but still recruited for military service, stormed the legislative chamber, intimidating the reps into calling for yet another election to choose another legislative body. This time, however, all wealth requirements for voting were scrapped. All French men could now cast a vote. On September 22nd of 1792, the new National Convention met for the first time and abolished the monarchy, suspending the powers of Louis XVI. Many of the delegates to the new legislature were tied to the radical left-wing Jacobin Club. A quick note about the use of left and right when talking about politics. Those terms, still used today, emerged during the Revolution. Those representatives who were more radical and wanted more change more quickly usually sat to the left of the speaker's podium, hence the term left-wing. Those reps who were more conservative and wanted to slow or even stop the pace of change sat to the speaker's right, hence the term right-wing. Today, therefore, people on the left tend to be more politically liberal, while those on the right tend to be more conservative. The delegates to the National Convention, therefore, tended to be quite radical and desired more changes to more aspects of French life. The convention found itself in a dire situation, however. It needed to create a new constitution, run the government in the meantime, and fight a war against two and soon more opponents. A rift was created among the delegates over the fate of the king. It was clear the king was guilty of treason. The debate was over what punishment he should receive. The more moderate faction, the Girondins, named after a French province called the Gironde, wanted the king either imprisoned or exiled. The more radical Mountain, so called because they occupied the highest seats in the convention hall, demanded execution. In a very close vote, it was decided that the king should die. In January 1793, Louis XVI was beheaded. This was a crucial moment for the revolution, for after you execute a king, there isn't anyone in the land you can't execute. The radicals in Paris, meanwhile, were not done influencing political events. On June 2nd of 1793, they once again stormed the convention hall. This time, they demanded the arrest of those Gironde members who called for anything less than the execution of the king. 29 delegates were arrested, and those remaining simply stopped attending meetings, leaving the convention in the hands of the most extreme, most radical members. Increasingly, day-to-day activities were being handled by the 12-man Committee of Public Safety. Maximilien Robespierre, whom we met earlier, was elected as a member of that committee and quickly became the voice of the revolution. Although Robespierre was a supporter of democracy, as the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, he helped enact a number of anti-democratic moves, always justifying his actions by arguing that France was in an emergency and so required extraordinary measures. Some of Robespierre's thoughts, however, seem quite contradictory. For example, he argued that in order to protect the liberty of the people, an absolute dictatorship was required. Apparently, after the emergency had passed, those liberties could be restored and everyone could enjoy them again. Perhaps the most destructive precedent Robespierre and other revolutionaries set was the identification of enemies as a means of uniting the people. Talk of counter-revolutionaries abounded, and conspiracy theorists, like the newspaper publisher and National Convention delegate Jean-Paul Marat, constantly played up how the work of the revolution was being undermined from within by domestic enemies hell-bent on ending freedom. Seeing counter-revolutionaries everywhere, in 1793, the convention launched its most ambitious and dangerous program to snuff them out. Called the Terror, it consisted essentially of martial law being imposed across the nation, with many civil liberties suspended for all people. The rights of man was officially suspended. Government officials whose loyalty to the revolution was suspect were summarily removed from office. The number of executions per day began to increase. Police spies were planted in bread lines to listen for any complaints about the government. Political clubs, especially women's political clubs, were shut down. The definition of what a suspect person was broadened. Laws protecting people from arbitrary police searches at night were repealed. In other words, the convention became a tyrannical organization with the Committee of Public Safety serving as a 12-man dictatorship. During the Reign of Terror from 1793 into the summer of 1794, everything became political. Everyday objects were emblazoned with revolutionary themes and colors. People were expected to wear a badge made out of red, white, and blue ribbons, reflecting the new tricolor flag the revolution had adopted. Festivals became an important part of a new civic religion that emphasized reason and secularism. While the National Assembly had tried to bring the church under state control through the CCC, the National Convention tried to simply eradicate the church through the de-Christianization program. Churches were closed and converted into, quote, temples of reason. Religious iconography was destroyed. Streets with the names of saints were renamed. A new calendar was created, with the year now composed of 12 30-day months. Each month contained 3 10-day periods called décades. Sundays were officially erased. Robespierre was opposed to this program. He believed the people needed faith, but he wanted them to put their faith in secular cults, cults of reason and liberty and the republic. The convention also moved to put education under the state's control instead of the church's. Primary schooling became free and mandatory for both boys and girls. However, as the state had no experience running a nationwide education system, there are some indications that literacy rates dropped during this period. The revolution even penetrated the language people used. French, like other languages derived from Latin, has formal versus informal words. For instance, if you were talking to someone older than you, or someone in a position of power over you, you would refer to them with the formal vous, meaning you. If you were speaking with someone younger or someone you were familiar with, you'd use the more informal tu. The revolution did not like this distinction between formal versus informal language and outlawed it. Additionally, the revolution also did not like the use of titles like monsieur, madame, mademoiselle. Titles smacked of the Ancien Régime, a time when there was no freedom. Therefore, everyone had to refer to everyone else as citoyen or citizen. The names of children also changed during this time, moving from biblical names to those associated with Rome, like Brutus and Gracchus. In addition to education, the state also took over the registering of births, deaths, and marriages from the church. The convention also made divorce legal and easy to obtain, something ended by Napoleon and not reinstituted until the late 20th century. Finally, the convention also called for equal inheritance for all children, forbidding parents from bestowing greater wealth or property on one child, usually the first, over others. Though members of the convention were overly obsessed with the notion of internal enemies, there were groups who resisted the revolution. As mentioned earlier, half the French clergy refused to swear the oath in the CCC. People sang royalist songs, refused to wear the tricolor badge, sheltered clergy, and in the case of a young woman named Charlotte Corday, assassinated leading revolutionaries like Jean-Paul Marat. Even more worrisome were the civil wars sparking up across France, most pressingly in the western Vendée region. Here, opponents of the revolution formed a Catholic and royal army 40,000 strong to fight against the convention. Fighting in the Vendée was vicious, as the combat here was not against foreign foes like the Austrians or the British, but rather against fellow Frenchmen. Atrocities were committed by both sides, and the war cost anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 lives. In late 1793, Robespierre began to lead the revolution against even erstwhile allies. He accused one former friend of being too radical, and had him and his followers rounded up and executed. When another friend, the bombastic Georges Danton, began to suggest that perhaps the violence needed to be lessened, Robespierre accused him of not being radical enough, and Danton and his followers were rounded up and executed. By summer of 1794, though, some delegates were tiring of Robespierre. The problems began with a major festival being held in Paris, the Festival of the Supreme Being. At the crucial moment of the celebration, a giant faux mountain had been constructed, and Robespierre emerged at the top of this mountain dressed in a toga, as if he now viewed himself as some sort of Greek god. Trouble continued when Robespierre gave a speech to the convention, claiming that he had a list of enemies to be executed, some of which were in that very chamber. He refused, however, to share the list when asked, which set some of the other delegates on edge. Was he preparing to accuse many of them and execute them? Was he buying time to move troops into position? The next day, when Robespierre stood to speak, the other reps shouted him down. He and some followers were arrested, and after a failed suicide attempt, Robespierre was beheaded. Ironically, after Robespierre's death, the pace of executions dwindled to almost none. It was as if the only thing that could stop the executions was the execution of the one guy continuously pushing to execute people. The power of the Committee of Public Safety waned, and a 5-man executive known as the Directory essentially ruled France for the next 5 years. Political prisoners of the convention were released, and the Jacobin Club, along many prisoners of the convention were released, and the Jacobin Club, along with many of its members, was suppressed. Much of what the terror had created was undone in what's known as the Thermidorian reaction, because according to the revolutionary calendar, the month of Robespierre's death was called Thermidor. The wars began by the Legislative Assembly would last in various forms from 1792 until Napoleon's final defeat in 1815. The creation of the National Convention coincided with the first real victory of French armies over foreign foes, and over time troops became more experienced, natural leaders emerged through the ranks, and the French armies began not only pushing foreign invaders out, but taking the fight into foreign lands themselves. By 1793, France was at war with Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. Not only did the French have superior manpower, fielding an army of at least 700,000 men most of the time, but those men were fighting for a revolution they were helping to create. In 1794, French armies moved into the Netherlands and drew up a new constitution based on that of France, essentially bringing the revolution to another land. At first, these French armies styled themselves as liberators. They believed they were freeing other people from despotism and granting them French-style liberties that they deserved. However, as the years went on, the French came to be seen less as liberators and more as occupiers. The Directory was especially keen on creating so-called, quote, sister republics out of the territories conquered by French armies. Across the Atlantic, the French Revolution had an impact on France's Caribbean colonies. Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, though small, were very economically valuable to France. Saint-Domingue, the western half of the island of Hispaniola, was home to 465,000 slaves, 28,000 free blacks, and 30,000 whites. In 1791, a slave revolt threatened to overthrow the white overseers. The National Assembly, back in Paris, reacted by granting increased rights to the free blacks living on the island, hoping to co-opt them into helping put down the revolt. This action, however, angered the whites on the island, who 2 years later signed a treaty with Great Britain to transfer possession of Saint-Domingue to British hands. Spain, who controlled the other half of Hispaniola, sided with the British. French leaders on Saint-Domingue, needing men to defend French claims to the territory, freed all the slaves. And the next year, the National Convention in Paris outlawed the slave trade. These steps attracted a talented black general, Toussaint Louverture, who had been fighting for Spain to try to free Saint-Domingue. Louverture switched sides and joined up with the French, successfully defending Saint-Domingue from both the British and the Spanish. Louverture, though, was arrested by Napoleon in 1802 as he attempted to reclaim the territory. Despite sending an army to retake possession of Saint-Domingue, French armies were defeated, and the Republic of Haiti was born in 1804. That does it for our look at the French Revolution. In this lesson, we examined political, philosophical, and religious developments during the Revolutionary era. If you have any questions about this presentation, please leave them in the comment section below or email me if you're one of my current students. If you'd like to do some additional reading on the Revolution, here are some books to get you started. Also, please subscribe to my channel if you have not already, and share this video with anyone you think would enjoy it. Finally, please act responsibly in the comment section, as only you can prevent flame wars. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all again soon.